Firstly, gosh, thank you so much, Seven Vassal, for inviting me here. Like, I think this is just such an amazing idea in terms of like, we always just see these finished products with papers, which, it kind of masks the fact that often it's a bit of a journey getting there, and it's not necessarily what you thought you were going to start, you get to, it's not exactly what you thought you were going to do when you started. Um, so I wanted to talk you guys through well, it's one paper, The Dynamics of Abusive Relationships, joint with Christina Hooden at Aalto, Emily Nix at USC, and Ning Zhang at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And perhaps slightly unusually in the seminar, what I wanted to do before getting into the details of the paper was first to sort of just like make the audience aware that for this paper, and this was actually a new thing for me in my work to date, you kind of need to think about it as one aspect of a wider agenda. About 6 years ago, I started an agenda around trying to better understand some of the economic dynamics around gender-based violence, partnered up with Christina, Emily, and Ning. Essentially, the agenda so far sort of is trying to make or makes, if you know, we didn't set up trying to make these points. It was through the research that three sort of things became obvious to us. So the first point is that the economic impact of violence against women and girls is very large, and it's typically wrong parties who suffer the largest penalties with very high potentials for backlash. I think that kind of that was sort of one of the first things that came out in the first paper that we produced in this sort of agenda, which is called Violence Against Women at Work. It's also the case that when we think about gender-based violence, our work suggests that there is evidence of persistent types of perpetrator who repeatedly engage in abusive behavior. And that's one aspect you'll also see in the paper that I'll talk about now, the dynamics of abusive relationships. And then the final kind of, I guess, point of the agenda so far is demonstrating that when we think about economic effects in this context, they really do spill over far beyond the victim. So we can think about in the domestic violence case, its spillover effects on children. In the workplace context, we show large impacts on other women who are working in firms, and actually changes in hiring practices. In our new paper on sexual assault specifically, we see huge impacts on peer effect on peer groups at school. So I just wanted to say this is sort of one paper, but of a cluster of work that we've been pursuing together, which makes the production process and saying exactly timelines for one paper a bit tricky because we've been kind of moving things forward in parallel. So getting into kind of the background as why it is that there's this kind of joint production function for these papers. So a lot of it in this case is to do with data. Because I have to like always thank Christina for this, Christina's fantastic relationships with Statistics Finland and the Finnish police. We've been able to work with the universe of police reports filed in Finland since 2006. And we're able to merge these, with administrative data on tax records, on demographics. In new work, we've also got mental health prescriptions and hospitalization records. Now, one of the key things which is novel in this context relative to some prior work was that we were able to get both victim IDs and perpetrator IDs. And that allows us to identify victims and perpetrators and therefore the relationship between them, and be very precise about certain types of event dates because of the Finnish data. So rather than just looking at points of assault, we are also going to be looking at actually the point of cohabitation as an event. So how should you think about police reports in this area? So they're the first step in a police investigation. There's a lot of issues with reporting here that won't be able to get into in like 10, 15 minutes. But what I did want to note is that some of the things that we do in reporting in the paper, I would say this is our best effort given the administrative data that we have. And some of the things that we've learned through doing this are actually spurring a new project specifically on reporting dynamics. So in terms of thinking specifically about the motivation for the paper we'll talk in detail about today, a lot of the focus of economics literature on IPV has often been on what's the relationship, if you like, between exogenous shifts in economic opportunities or economic empowerment and the incidence of violence. And in this paper, what we're trying to do is flip, if you like, that sort of thing and think, so actually, how does domestic violence and cohabiting with abusive partners shape women's economic opportunities? So the causal direction, in a sense, running in the opposite direction, given that there's a huge literature in other disciplines and a lot of policy impacts specifically on that causal channel. Now, why has this not really been looked at so much before? Well, in the context of like an empirical kind of context, well, data limitations here are super difficult. So when we think about survey data, or if you just have access to data around a police report, everything is centered on a report of physical violence or victimization. Whereas what we're going to be wanting is to understand what's the dynamics of economic outcomes in these relationships right from the point when people get together. So that obviously imposes a huge data requirement. It's also the case that some of the reasons why we think abusive relationships might impact women's economic outcomes are just super difficult to measure directly. So a concept that comes up a lot in this literature is so-called coercive control. And actually that's very difficult actually to measure. You can kind of think about it directly. The coercive point there is doing a lot of action. So just to give a bit of a sense about why I personally was really motivated to start this project. Actually, I'll get into that later. I don't have enough time. But anyway, just to give you a bit of a flavor of some of what we're going to be kind of capturing here. The first quote gives you some survivor testimony saying the first feature of control was financial. As soon as I had less economic independence, that's when the violence started. And you have a number of charities and stakeholders, again, talking about economic abuse being designed to reinforce or create economic instability, such that, actually women can end up staying in with abusive men for longer. I'm going to skip. So in this paper, what we do with this very rich data environment is establish 3 new stylized facts, treating rather than the point of reporting of physical assault as an event, we're going to be treating the point of cohabitation as the key event here. So we're going to show you that there are large and immediate falls in victims' economic outcomes right from the point of cohabitation. I'm going to show you that men who are violent towards women in one context suppress women's economic outcomes in all their on average, all their cohabiting relationships, even when no violence is reported. And we also show some interesting heterogeneity in this decline in outcomes. The reason I'm not going to talk about this so much today, but in the paper to rationalize some of this heterogeneity and also then fit it into this kind of wider interdisciplinary literature on coercive control. In the paper, we develop a kind of simple dynamic model of abusive relationships where women don't perfectly observe their partner's type, so abusive men can have an incentive to use economic suppression to sabotage women's outside options. So just to think about how we're thinking about defining things here. So because of these victim and perpetrator IDs, we're going to be looking at cohabitation, police reports where individuals were cohabiting either at the time of a crime or they could have cohabited in the previous 5 years. And that's that's what the approach recommended by Statistics Finland. Now, it turns out that this domestic violence is incredibly prevalent. So if you take all of the people in Finland who move in together in 2006, basically 3% of those couples end up with a police report for domestic violence within 10 years. So that's 3% with a police report, okay? So why is this going to be tricky for us to think about establishing the causal impact of cohabiting with an abusive partner? There's a lot of things going on here. One thing is, even before people start cohabiting, those who end up in abusive relationships have different characteristics to those where we don't see police reports. So this table shows you summary statistics in the year before cohabitation, and we can see that victims have lower rates of college completion, they're more likely to be on antidepressants, they're less likely to be employed, and they have lower earnings. So these are things we're going to be want to be mindful about. I'm actually going to skip that because of time. So of course, as I've said, causal identification here is tricky. Decision of when to cohabit, who to cohabit with, they're not random events. And as I've just shown you, women forming relationships with abusive men have worse economic outcomes even before we observe cohabitation. It's also the case that the cohabitation with an abusive partner there's a bundled treatment here. There's a lot of different dimensions to behavior that could be driving effects. And like this, the fine line between a mechanism and an identification kind of concern is sort of a bit fuzzy in some areas. So what we do is essentially use the fact that we have insanely rich data here to find a victim's doppelganger in the Finnish population who cohabits with a man who looks observationally similar to the person who our victim is going to cohabit with. But in one case, we see police reports for DV, and in the other, we don't. Now, this is not a perfect identification strategy. Happy to talk about this in questions. But our approach has been to be as transparent as possible about essentially what's going on with the raw means. Let's be really transparent about what the identification concerns are with this type of design, and then really try and provide as much additional triangulation evidence as possible to show you that we do not think that those concerns are relevant in this context. So to give you the kind of headline results here, so what you've got here is on the x-axis, time from cohabitation, and on the y-axis, we've got employment rates. And so what you can see is that this is these employment rates for victims who are going to people who are going to cohabit with an abusive partner at 0 in the years leading up to cohabitation. So what we can see is that whilst employment rates are lower than kind of similar age education groups, that actually employment rates are increasing in the years leading up to cohabitation. So with our matched kind of control approach, what we find is essentially these women's doppelgangers, and then follow them and see what happens to them when they end up cohabiting with a guy at 0 who looks similar to our the perpetrator. And then we say, okay, so what happens to victims, however? So the match control, what we can see for the match controls is that cohabitation isn't like an event which causes we see a smooth evolution of employment outcomes around cohabitation, whereas for those who enter into abusive relationships, employment rates drop right from, relative to trend, right from the point of cohabitation. And we actually see absolute falls in employment relative to the pre-cohabitation baseline for these individuals. So in a matched, being more formal about this, what we see is that in the matched diff and diff design, we get about a 6 percentage point fall in employment rates in the 5 years leading after cohabitation. Now, this is really, really large. This is remember, everyone here is the match controls also are cohabiting at 0. Okay, so this is an effect relative to other people who look observationally similar, also start cohabiting at 0. So this is a really large effect. We see similarly large effects when it comes to earnings as well. And if you take for the group that we can see up to 10 years following, these declines are pretty persistent. Now, here what I wanted to kind of just probe is part of, if you like, our innovation relative to the prior literature is to say, well, what we need to think about is cohabitation, not necessarily just a police report, okay? And so here what we do is we look at what do these kind of event studies look like for people who report in the first 2 years of a relationship versus those who report more than 2 years after the start of a relationship. And the key thing here is that for people who are reporting at least 2 years after they enter into the relationship, it's still the point of cohabitation, which is the primary event here, okay? So this is trying to say that this distinction between cohabitation versus a police report is meaningful. Now, the thing I just wanted to end with before, taking some more questions, is something this is something as well that I'm kind of building out in other papers at the moment. That one of the issues with thinking about causal effects of cohabitation is there could be it's I'm just getting PTSD from certain kind of questions I get in seminars, but for victims it's a bundled thing. You're going in, you're cohabiting, and you're cohabiting with an abusive partner. So is it just that this is something about how victims behave when they're cohabiting? So for this, what we're able to do is actually look within individual across relationships because of this Finnish data. So we form the whole network of cohabiting relationships in Finland, so we can compare victims' outcomes when they're cohabiting with abusive men versus non-abusive men. Similarly, what we're going to be able to do is for abusive men who we know are abusive in one context, we're going to see what happens to women's outcomes who cohabit with them but don't report DV themselves. So this is going to allow us to say to what extent are these match effects versus individual effects for victims and perpetrators. So what we see for victims is that this is a match effect. This is not something that they do in every relationship. So here, this is a triple diff approach. Essentially, if all of these were zero, what we would say is that actually, even in non-abusive relationships that victims form, or non-reported abusive relationships that victims form, we don't see that their outcomes are similar. But the fact that we see as well this decline in outcomes tells us that when victims are in abusive relationships, their outcomes are significantly worse than in their non-abusive relationships. I'm actually going to go straight to this in the interest of time. For men, it's a different story. So here what we see is that for individuals who cohabit with a partner who has been abusive to another woman, okay, either here just for power, either another intimate partner, or they've been violent towards a colleague, or they've been violent in a dating relationship. What we see is that women's outcomes fall in these. So even women who don't report DV in that relationship, their outcomes are significantly worse from the start of cohabitation than otherwise similar women who cohabit with men who aren't abusive towards women in other scenarios. Now, the panel at B tells you that this is not just a violence effect. If I take people who cohabit with men who are violent towards other men, actually their outcomes are kind of trending the same as there's no sort of excess fall in their economic outcomes. So it's violence against women here, which seems to be a defining trait, which is associated with these declines in women's outcomes at the point of cohabitation, even for women who aren't reporting abuse themselves. So just to kind of stop, I really passionately believe that economic issues are fundamental to understanding gender-based violence and supporting victims. There's a large kind of number of different areas to this, even if it's not necessarily the first thing that you think of in terms of a natural economics topic. I also think there's just so much good economics work to be done in this area. And yeah, with that, I will stop talking and take your questions.
Thank you so much, Abby, for this very interesting and tight presentation. So Vatalis will share the link to the survey, and while we're doing this, if anyone has a question, of course, please feel free to leave it to the chat. But I would like to ask you a first question. Actually, you mentioned PTSD from seminar questions, but I think there is a broader PTSD question of how do you handle working on a topic like this from your side, also of being a female, and while also the scientist hat of wanting to be as neutral as possible in your approach. So I'd love to hear a little bit how you've been thinking about these things.
I think that is such a good question. Okay, so there are, I think, three different things that I'd say to that. So the first is that actually I have found it very challenging from a mental health perspective. So usually the way that our team would work is that Ning and I would do a lot of the tag teaming on the empirical work for these projects. And there was a period where We had a couple of deadlines, and basically I was just working in the data like all day, every day for weeks. And I got to the end of like week three, and my mood was really off, and I was like, God, what is going on? And it's like, wow, it's actually not very surprising. Like I find it very, very draining kind of actually working on these issues and appreciating that every line in the data set is that's someone's life. I think that's can be very affecting. So to be perfectly frank, like I have had mental health support at times through sort of working on these issues, and I think that that's actually something which is quite sensible to do. The other thing which I have, going back to actually the way that you motivated some of like uh, this talk and this agenda, Sev, um, I kind of have felt really passionately that, like, in order to sort of justify to myself and getting private rents from working on these issues, um, I need to make sure that what we're doing translates into something which actually supports and helps people. Because otherwise, it also feels just sort of it kind of feels wrong, to be honest. And so that's been some of that has happened in the context of the UK. So kind of engaging with policymakers there on the context of them building up their violence against women strategy with the new Labour government. I recently moved to Chicago, and now I'm actually working with the state attorney's office here and the mayor and like the kind of city government on how do we use this research to sort of help inform some of their strategies, and also like help them experiment as well a little bit on what works in this context. So I think actually not finding routes that you actually do like change the thing, or like at least you try to try and kind of, I think that's been important. The final thing as well, just kind of point on the neutral on the neutral point. It has been interesting working in these areas in terms of like how do we maintain sort of like neutrality, if you like, and whilst like feeling, we all have stories. Like how is it that you kind of that you go about that? One of the first things I'll say is actually with the workplace project, originally that project was called Toxic Colleagues. It wasn't actually going to be about gender. And then we did the splits by gender. And I just remember in the context of this Zoom call, I was just like staring at this table and I was like, well, this is a gender project. It turns out like actually that you can't get away from it. Um, and as well with some of the mechanisms, I think what's kind of been helpful for me in thinking about this is that actually some of the mechanism I've been proved wrong actually in some of my priors through working on this area. Um, Things like so again in the workplace context, trying to explain why is it that in male managed firms you see big spillover effects to the rest of the workforce, and you don't in female managed firms. And so I think as well, kind of with this lens of my experience is partial. I'm working on this because I'd like to make it better. It's been that's been kind of helpful in terms of keeping that surprise and like flat prior on in a bunch of areas.
Yeah. I love your answers. I think that's very true. It's interesting that there are four females right on the project, and I don't know what would be the treatment effect of bringing a male to the collaboration and thinking about this.
Yeah.
To what extent you thought about this, how this could shape a little bit the way we look at the data, we frame the evidence, we think about mechanisms.
I think that's actually and because I think something men are really missing in a lot of the in a positive way. I think in a lot of the narrative here. Um, so part of it has just been okay. So how can I answer this? Um, so um, men have not been missing, if you like, from how I think about engagement and how we think about kind of actually contextualizing our results. What is it that we do about this? What are the things that we're missing? So Um, One of the things, so a lot of this work wouldn't have been possible without funding from the ERC. And one of the things that they specified was that I needed to have an ethics advisor, not just do IRB, but like actually have someone who I talked to about the papers, and who wasn't allowed to be an economist. Like, but like they're like, we don't trust you. Like, you're gonna mess this up. And that was also very helpful, just in terms of getting a slightly broader perspective, ensuring that my priors, other things weren't actually sort of dictating the ways that research projects go. One of the things that actually has become very interesting, which I think which I think we'll need to do much more engagement with different groups on, is so in the most recent project on sexual assault. The reporting is really important here for how we think about the gender dynamics and who's turning up in these police reports. Um, and In the sexual assault paper, we've also now complemented everything with hospitalization records. So we try and identify sexual assaults also through hospitalization. Now, it's still the case that the overwhelming and vast majority of victims in either source are women. Um, but you see that amongst men, they are vastly less likely to report to the police. We see many proportionately we see many more men through the hospital data than not. Um, so I think kind of understanding some of these reporting dynamics, I think that will also be, and one of the, as I said, we're trying to do this new project on reporting, which will be about, gender-based violence more broadly. Men get harassed too, as you know, there's these are, and so making sure that our questions are appropriate and sort of make sense given that context. I think you're right. Um, I'm sorry, I'm probably talking too much, but on the how our project, in terms of the slightly kind of happenstance, as these ways, as all, well, maybe it doesn't, maybe some people are more organized than I am, but in terms of how it was that we ended up working together, it was for it was basically what happened was I was at a conference, a really random conference. So I wasn't even presenting. I was actually just there to chair a session, and I'd been looking for data for a while to try and look at these like abusive relationships from cohabitation. Um, and saw Emily present a paper on basically how do we think about the causal impact of fines versus prison sentences using the Finnish data. And we got chatting, and it's like, oh, any chance you see domestic violence in your data? And turns out that court records there aren't anyway can't do it anyway. Finland is kind of it's small and you don't want to use court records are tricky in this area. Um, there was talking to Christina, realized about the police report data, and then we're able to hire Ning through the ERC grant. So it was sort of one of those sort of, it wasn't that but I had this thing where how is it that you build a co-author team? Oh, let's think about all the people from the beginning. Yeah, I think the approach has been making sure that we talk like broadly to people to make sure that we're interpreting results in the right way and also communicating, I think, in the right way.
Yeah. Amazing. It's super interesting. That's how are we doing on the forecast?
I think we can go ahead now, so I can share my screen,
Yeah.
and then we can walk through the questions one by one. 1 second. Wait, sorry, should be able to see my entire screen. Okay, so now we can start taking the questions on the behind the scenes of the paper. So the first one was, how many years do you think it took the researchers to go from conceiving the idea to getting it published? And this is what the audience said. And Abby, your response was 6 years. So the audience is quite spot on. I'm happy to take a few questions and then you want to comment, or as you prefer.
What do you know how to do this better? What we could do, I guess, is maybe take a couple, and then I don't know. Do people want to ask questions about? I've got a story about this, but like maybe we could take a
Yeah,
couple. So otherwise I'll end up
sounds
talking
good.
too much.
Yeah, that sounds good. Um, The next question was about how many times do you think the presenter presented the paper at an external conference or seminar? Based on feedback that we had from our previous iterations, now we've modified the question. Earlier, we just had 4 or more times, and then we realized that economists actually do present a lot more than we think. So this is what the audience said, and you said it's just like 15 times, and that's just you, so that the entire team would have
Oh,
a
okay. So I was
difficult.
counting a little bit like some other people as well, but I presented, yeah, I presented this a lot.
Yeah. Okay, we can take one more question, I think. Actually, why don't we comment on this? So, like, before we get into the peer review bit, if you want to talk more about how you already mentioned that you met at a conference, but yeah, if you want to discuss more about how the collaboration formed over the
yeah.
years. Yeah.
I guess just kind of on all of this. Uh, I ended up getting interested in this topic after helping with a court case actually in the UK where they needed some assistance with statistics for a court case about whether the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK had unlawfully denied domestic violence and sexual violence victims access to justice by essentially not charging cases in a way which you're supposed to. And so like that's why it was sort of 2018 was when I was sort of working on that, reading some of the economics literature because I got interested, thinking, wait a second, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I've just been exposed to in terms of how people think about these relationships, and this just seems to be totally missing from the economics literature, which often was written, not everything, but quite a few of early papers. It was almost like, there would be some shock which would cause a particular type of domestic incident or an assault. But beyond that shock occurring, those relationships were totally normal. And it was like, mm, doesn't quite feel right. And it just took the first part in terms of getting the relationship established with Emily and Christina and getting the data. That was something that took quite a long time. But then conditional on those sorts of things coming to fruition, it went very quickly. Um, in terms of the presenting externally, I wouldn't, it's kind of funny what advice you would give other people. I was so excited about this work that I started presenting it quite early, to be honest, as partly as it was in development. Um, and that yeah, as I say, I wouldn't, it was, you would only do that in particular types of audiences because it requires quite a lot of generosity on the part of the audience. And with these types of topics, audiences to sometimes be a little bit behaved as well in terms of what types of questions can come out of people's mouths. Um, but it was very helpful in terms of because of this issue that it is a complex causal question. How is it that, what does it mean to sort of present this kind of work in a compelling and persuasive manner? Like, what is it that people really, what are their core concerns? That was very helpful. So that's also one of the reasons why it ended up getting presented quite a lot, to be honest, probably before submission.
Mhm. And how does it compare to your other projects in terms of the time taken? You said 6 years. Um,
Gosh. So I think the difference is the split. So um here the time was a lot of it was data, hiring Ning, sort of getting everything started. But then once we did, uh it was just boom, it was just super, super quick. Um other projects that and I have to say, I've learned a lot from my co-authors about what does it mean to have like an effective and efficient production process for papers through the collaboration because two of my co-authors, so one needed, Ning was on a postdoc contract. She needed to have stuff by the end to help get a job. Emily was on the US tenure track. And so that was actually also very helpful in terms of us sitting down and thinking, okay, so actually, what are our milestones? Like, how is it that we coordinate as a team to make sure that we can think about what the right timelines are for people and how we can prioritize moving different projects forward. So in my other projects, and again, I think I've got way better, but like partly through this experience, you're working on like 15 things at once. And it turns out that even if you make quite a lot of progress early, the amount of time between that first result and submission is long often. And that's not the case with this project. And I found it so much more rewarding to work in that way.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, just want to remind the audience that they can also feel free to unmute themselves and ask questions at any point. We can now move on to the questions on peer review. So the first one was, how many journals was this paper submitted to before acceptance? And you said one. We can take a couple here as well if you want. Sorry, you were
So
about
I
to.
should say, so here, I'm not sure if I just missed the zero. So this was the lucky, and I can tell you about the interpretation of this. So this did actually, the first paper, the first journal we submitted this to was QJE, and it went in. Might be helpful because I sort of that's unusual, everyone. Like, and we didn't expect that. So I don't know, I might just say something on that. So this is partly the production, the fact that we've had a couple of papers going at the same time, which are sort of similar. So we learn a lot about how to write the paper from the referee process with the workplace violence paper. So lots of descriptives, lots of transparency, really being as like kind of actually we're going to tell you that this isn't a perfect identification strategy because it's not. We can't think of a better one. Haven't seen anyone else think of a better one. But let's think really, 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 really concretely about what the concerns are and what is it that we can do to show that we do not think that that is what's driving our results. So that was kind of, we learned that earlier. We also, in terms of the point about timelines, I never thought that we'd get this published without the hospitalization data. Getting the hospitalization data from through Statistics Finland and getting the ethics and everything, it took 2 years. So it was a very long time. So when it was kind of becoming clear that this just wasn't moving at the speed that for some of the team, that we needed at least to sort of get a sense of where this would place or what are the issues, even just with the analysis that we were doing, like let alone what we were applying it to. We just decided, right, you know what, we're getting great feedback in seminars. We've got this long list of things which we'd ideally like to do, but we can't see a path for this to happen in the next 6 months. Let's submit it and sort of just see where we get to. And we sort of also then, through the course of actually writing it up and just saying, like, let's just sort of try and do what we can with the data that we have, given that we still have a bunch of innovation. We realized that some of the across relationship stuff that I told you also helped us with some of the reporting points. So because and so it was, so that was partly, so we thought this was never going to happen. But we had already learned, I think, a bunch from related work on how to present this type of stuff. But yeah, I wanted to say something because this I was thinking, should I have presented another paper? Because like then it's like, well, you like have to like normally you have to slug through like a whole bunch of stuff, and this one sort of the slogging was earlier, and then it sort of worked out nicely.
How do you think, Abby, about the order in which you submit the paper? So, like, I mean, of course, there are, right, like 5 top 5s, and then right? You could also, I mean, it would be interesting to kind of think about your submission strategies in general and how you think about maybe editorial fit, style of like how do you think about these things in general?
Yeah. So, to be honest, it was time for us that was really important as like uh different journals have norms around how quickly they turn things around. So that was partly for us one of the reasons which made kind of QJE very sort of appealing was we thought actually, this isn't embarrassing. It's not that we would be a tax on other people through necessarily. I think submitting papers way before they're too early and just saying, oh, I should get some reports. That's not a great thing to do because you're sort of, and we weren't at that stage, but I did think that there was a bunch of stuff which, if I was a referee, I would like be concerned about, but which we just couldn't do that much on. And so part of it was, how do we think about an outlet which firstly respected our need to be kind of quick and efficient to help with co-authors, tenure cases and whatnot. And how do we think about the sort of uh, journals which maybe, okay, certain types of questions are just very difficult to get a perfect identification strategy for. And it's always a balance, like size of the contribution and how you see that relative to some of the fudginess and which I think we're quite transparent about in terms of like the difficulties with interpretation and identification in this space. So for that reason, like QJE seemed like a good fit. The violence against women at work paper, just to sort of again put cards on the table, that did get rejected with 3 negative reports from AER the first time that we submitted it. And what was interesting was that the reports really helped us realize that a whole bunch of things that we'd had to convince ourselves of through writing the paper and convincing ourselves that the results were robust, we'd sort of like left out of the paper because it was like, oh, that's all like the messy stuff, or it's like, oh, all of those things checked. So why does anyone want to know? And we basically had 3 reports, which they could all actually have been summarized in like one sentence, which was, don't really believe match diff and diff. and um, and so that was also helpful in terms of saying, okay, but no one provided comments about exactly what they were concerned about. So what was the thing which they thought invalidated that strategy? And so that was actually very helpful. And basically, we rewrote the introduction and we just put a whole bunch more descriptives in to say, look, these for our perspective, these are the identification concerns in this context. These are the types of shocks. Let's step through what that shock would actually have to be to explain this result, this result, this result, this result, and this result. It kind of seems implausible relative to the shock that one colleague assaulted someone else at work. Like, so yeah, so that's kind of where we got to.
That's very helpful. Yeah.
All right. Let's take a few more questions. How many rounds of revisions do you think the paper went through after receiving the first response? And you said 1 round. So the majority of the audience overestimated how much time it took. And in terms of how much time it took to actually address that revision, you said 7 months. Okay. This relates to the next question as well about the pitch, but did you have to revise the pitch of the paper, or like what kind of comments did you get that in that round? Yeah.
So so the okay, so a lot of the comments on this paper were and were actually this is it's kind of like we got a bunch of reports which are the reports I would love to write as a referee. you know, when you're like, it's not that they like loved everything, obviously, but they were really concrete about what the concerns were. Not always, because this takes a lot of time as a referee, but in a couple of contexts, they also said these would be the three things that I would try. Um, and that was really, really helpful. So I actually learned, and I've in every paper actually here, I've learned a lot through addressing the comments, and it's actually really deepened, I think, my understanding and my appreciation for what the concerns are in this context. Um, so one of the, if you like, one of the reasons it was relatively quick was because a lot of what we needed to do was be more transparent. Even though I said we tried to be as transparent as possible, a lot of it was sort of just really about explaining even more carefully why the things that we put in the paper helped address those original sort of identification concerns, which again, the first time you're writing stuff, you're like, well, the reason I did it is because of that concern. But you don't really spell out, okay, so the reason that this answer here really says that this thing isn't an issue, sometimes by the time you're kind of writing that, it's like, oh God, I'm kind of over it. Like I want to move on to the next thing. And so that was like quite a lot, I think. And also using language, which I wouldn't have thought to have used before as well, which I think the referees were really, really helpful for. Um, or thinking about our across relationship results, partly is helping us to think about bounding certain types of reporting effects. That was also super helpful. So it was deepening what we'd already done as opposed to, oh, you know what, actually, we do believe that you need the hospitalization data. So and that would have taken a huge amount of time. So I feel, yeah, very grateful actually to the referees for being so kind of balanced and helpful, I think.
That's great to hear. Yeah. I think a lot of it, right, is like a contextualization, helping with interpretation, what you were saying about bonding effects, giving benchmarks, helping people think about effect sizes, all of these things that sometimes we end up forgetting actually. And reviewers can be incredibly useful and instrumental in terms of like pushing us to think about that and placing it in a broader context.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay. Then we had a question about I think the revision of the pitch. And you said you revised the pitch of the paper twice. Were there any, like, what was the difference in the pitch between the two times that you wrote it?
So I was also trying to think about it in terms of, as I said, the slightly risky strategy, which I would not necessarily recommend. It's state dependent about like starting to present early. Um, so part of that part, I would say one of the changes in pitches was partly through presentation, and then the other main pitch change was I think how we thought of these across relationship results. So the first version of the paper, written version of the paper, the kind of the across relationship results were sort of there as robustness checks, but like mixed in to our main results section. And when we rewrote the paper to for the as part of the revision, we actually just sort of completely split like the strategies and had the across relationship results sort of out in their own section alone. And that just made and just thinking about what precisely those results were helping us to understand was really, really helpful. Um, the other thing that was helpful was and it's again these things that when that get lost between inspiration and then like when you actually get into the data. So one of the reasons that for me at least I really wanted to work in this area was a lot of the stakeholder evidence around coercive control is very, very tightly linked to how we think about economic empowerment and economic opportunities. But is very difficult to evidence. And so then it's like, oh, well, we need to start looking at what happens from the starts of relationships and how whole paths start to diverge. But then when we sort of got to the point of sort of writing, and it's like, oh, well, the event, we're in economics world now. The event is cohabitation. It's not point of report. And a lot of then that wider sort of like literature from sociology, from criminology, from psychology on how we think about coercive control had then sort of like eked out into the background. And I think as well, because we'd been a bit nervous about, well, we don't actually have a direct measurement of coercive control. So to what extent is this coercive control versus non-reported violence, which is occurring before something like ends up in a police report? Well, I think we don't have a strong this it is X or is it Y. I think it's probably both what we uncover. But that's also then when we started thinking about the heterogeneity in across, okay, so which are the types of women who are most affected by this? To what extent do we think that this would be consistent with coercive control versus simply it being unreported physical violence? And then thinking through the role of the model in sort of actually providing a more formal route to say our results are at least consistent with coercive control being operative in these contexts. So that was also, I think, learning a little bit of nuance in how we could put back in things that we did think were first order relevant from these other sources and which were very much consistent with our results, even if we can't say this is the only thing that's operative, because life's messy. Of course, it's not the only thing that's operative, and so that was also quite that was also, I think, learning to kind of how to write that in that nuanced way. I think again, there's definitely things I would change about how the paper's written, and we could definitely, you can always improve stuff. But that was one of the things which I liked how the evolution of that in the paper.
Mm-hmm. All right. Next question was how many times the introduction was changed purely for stylistic reasons, and there you said 1 to 3. I have a question slightly related to this, and this also stems from when you tweeted about the seminar. You mentioned that you're going to talk about this. I'm going to ask you to do that, which is about getting a question from the seminar audience or from I don't know, a referee, which is how is this economics? And that there's still a niche, there's still a minority, I'd like to believe at least, who ask that question. So how do you, in your writing and while presenting the paper, address that? Like, what's the best way to address that question?
Oh, I think that is such a good question. It's also so hard. I mean, okay, I think there are two things here. I think uh, if would this paper have got the reception that it did if we wrote it 15 years ago? No, I don't think it would. So and I think it's, very, I think uh, uh, the profession and I think how we sort of think about certain types of issues and to be honest, the role of um, relationships as well and in how we think about the determination of economic outcomes has evolved, I think, quite a lot. If you look over the last uh, kind of 20 years. The undergraduate course I've taught this year has been on the economics of the family. So it's also been interesting as part for me, sort of, I had to do a bit of disclaimer at the beginning in terms of a lot of the literature that we think about, it's written with the kind of this particular normative and cultural context in mind. But then you see papers that have come out over the last kind of 5 years, and actually it's become, I think, kind of, there has been an evolution. So that's one thing. Like, I can't take full credit for this. I think there's partly a reception point. I think the other thing for me was when I was thinking about what is it that I could add value here in terms of as an economist with my types of training, with the types of outcomes that actually we're able to observe. Is this actually going to be something that is worth spending my time on if it's not going to change, like if it's not going to add new relevant evidence here? And for me, one of the things Okay, this is not for this paper, but it's related because, as I say, this is a thing. Okay, so people often ask me this. This has come up a lot with the economic impact of rape paper, because I think that even relative to something like domestic violence, that is just we might think sitting here that the moral awfulness and trauma associated with those types of assaults should be sufficient for us as a society to think about, I don't know, what are the steps, how much should we be thinking about investment and, prevention, etc. And there are two things here. The first is that, like, we live in a kind of a cost-benefit public policy world where, when we're thinking about, in many contexts, how is it that we justify spending money in this area of law enforcement versus that area of law enforcement, thinking about the quantification of the economic magnitude of harm is important. In the current literature, how this is done in public health is you basically add up the number of days in victimization surveys that people self-report having to have taken time off work to deal with the aftermath of an assault. So going to the hospital for an exam, reporting, etc. And on average, that is 3.6 days when it comes to sexual assault. So then you do the calculation, 3.6 days times wage rate. In the UK, they also have a bit more of a calculation around lost productivity. But the UK Home Office number is about £6,000 in terms of the economic cost of a sexual assault. And so it was sort of saying, okay, well, that then gets embedded in how do we think about health costs and the costs of the criminal justice system, etc. But what happens if that is just a huge underestimate? Like, actually, how do, like, the economics is in how we're actually thinking about this as a society, but we're just thinking about it, to be honest, in a really partial and marginal way. So that's one thing that I've kind of that has been important to me. The other thing was also why I start with some of those quotes actually in with some of this, which is economics is how not just economics professors, but how stakeholders and survivors actually think about relevant issues in this area. So that's also I found kind of helpful for framing, just to say we might not think of these things as either being linked to economic dynamics or to be having particularly large economic effects. And it turns out that actually we're wrong, that prior is wrong on both.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. I am aware we've run out of time, but what we can do is, because we should make time for audience questions as well, we have two more remaining, which is how challenging did you think each of these tasks were for you? And the audience, I think, anticipated it correctly, which is data collection was the most challenging. What you said was, yeah, data collection as well, being the most challenging, and then writing and structuring the paper. And then finally, last question was on time use, on how much time it took for each of these components. And you said data analysis took you the most time. Sorry, this is what the audience said. And you also said that data analysis took the most time. This is, I think, one of those rare instances when the audience has been quite accurate throughout the talk.
Well done.
Yeah, so Abby, if you want to comment, but we can also probably open it up to
yeah, well, I think I've touched on a bunch of these things. I'm happy if there are a couple of last questions.
Yeah. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask any question. Yeah.
No. You covered a lot of ground, and I think it's just also signals how an amazing research agenda you have ahead in front of you. I think the fixed costs are huge, but then the marginal costs, I would hope, is actually quite low, conditional having made all these investments. That's truly exciting. If there is no question, feel free also, of course, to submit any questions afterwards that we can potentially relate to Abby if there is something that we can potentially answer for you guys that you wondered after the fact. But thank you so much, Abby, for the wonderful presentation. and the really exciting and courageous work that you're doing in this context is really, really inspiring.
Okay, well, thank you so much again for the invitation and great questions. And yeah, see you all soon.
You, thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks.